Hey, what's going on everyone? Greg here, and Apple just released two brand new iPad Pros updated with the powerful M1 chip. But there's still a lot you need to know before you decide to buy this iPad, because not all models are created equal. Okay, before we jump into the video, I just wanted to put up my usual disclaimer that I do for all of my buyer's guide videos, and that this buyer's guide is really for people who are going to be pre-ordering the iPad Pro as soon as April 30th. I want to give you as much information as I possibly can, but know that I ultimately don't have the iPad Pro, so I do recommend that most people wait for the full review of the iPad Pro for when it actually comes out so I can give you even more detail, because right now I'm just going off of what Apple says, and that isn't always 100% reliable. But I know my audience is usually just as impatient as I am, and I know a lot of you are going to pre-order this on April 30th, so let me try and give you the best information that I have right now. First of all, let's do a quick refresher on what's new with the iPad Pro. So for the most part, the design of this iPad Pro is pretty much the same as the past version, with an 11 and 12.9 inch display option. I say for the most part because the 12.9 inch version is 0.1 pounds heavier than the previous model, now weighing in at 1.5 pounds. The iPad Pro on the 12.9 inch version is also slightly thicker than previous iterations and is now 6.4 millimeters in thickness compared to the 5.9 millimeters on the old 12.9 inch iPad Pro and the current 11 inch version. So for all those people who are saying, the 2018 and 2020 iPad Pro bend, well, the 12.9 version is a little bit thicker this year, so maybe it won't bend as easily. Now, this isn't the real reason why this version of the iPad Pro is thicker on the 12.9 inch version. The reason why the 12.9 inch model is thicker is because of the new mini LED display, or as Apple calls it, the Liquid Retina XDR display, which packs in 10,000 miniature LED lights that give the iPad Pro a 1,000,000:1 contrast ratio with 1,000 nits of full screen brightness and peak screen brightness of 1,600 nits in HDR scenes. Now, this new mini LED display on paper sounds like it's going to look really good, and when Apple introduces a new display technology into their devices, it's usually a major jump in display fidelity, but we won't know for sure until we get our hands on this device. So it's kind of hard right now to tell you how much better the mini LED display will actually be, but again, right now on paper, it sounds really good. Now, unfortunately, this new mini LED display is exclusive to the 12.9 inch version of the iPad Pro, so the 11 inch version still has the same exact Liquid Retina display as last year's model, with 600 nits of max brightness, True Tone, ProMotion, and P3 wide color gamut support. However, both iPads do get the same exact M1 chip, and yes, you didn't mishear me, the M1 chip, the same exact chip found in the latest M1 Max that I have been ranting and raving about for the past 4 months now. This is going to be a huge leap in power from the A12X chip, with 50% faster CPU performance and 40% faster graphics. The M1 also enables other advantages, like 2 times faster storage. Because it has the M1, Apple is also supercharging the port, upgrading it from a standard USB-C port to a Thunderbolt port, now has 40 gigabits of bandwidth, and will now be compatible with Thunderbolt accessories like Thunderbolt docks, external storage, and displays. The iPad Pro still comes with 2 rear cameras, a 12 megapixel wide-angle lens and a 10 megapixel ultra-wide-angle lens, and the new LiDAR scanner they added on the 2020 iPad Pro for enhanced augmented reality. Now, there's actually a newer camera on the front of the iPad Pro for this year, and that is a 12 megapixel ultra-wide-angle camera. This has a new feature called Center Stage, which will use machine learning to actually move the camera position around as you use it for video calls, and it can recognize multiple people in a video call and adjust the position accordingly. I actually think it's a pretty smart and clever trick for when you're using the iPad Pro in a video call, and this seems like it was just built for group video calls with the family. So I'm actually kind of curious to check out this camera feature. Usually with iPad camera features, I'm kind of like, I don't need it, but for video calls, I've been doing a lot more of that recently, so that could be pretty helpful. Now, not to be outdone by the iPhone 12, the iPad Pro now also has the option to add 5G cellular access. However, that is an additional charge from the standard Wi-Fi model, and it's actually a $200 upgrade. That is really expensive, so for me, I think I'm just going to be sticking with a Wi-Fi model. All right, let's talk some buying advice because I think this is a really hard choice right now because there's so many different iPad options. And now there's an even harder choice between the 11 and 12.9-inch iPad Pro. So first of all, I should note that the starting price for the 11-inch is the same as last year's, starting at $799 for 128 gigabytes of storage. The 12.9-inch iPad Pro is getting a price increase this year because of that exclusive mini LED display, and that will now start at $100 more at $1,099, which is $100 more than a MacBook Air. Crazy. That means there's also now a $300 price difference between the base 11-inch iPad Pro and the base model of the 12.9-inch iPad Pro. Right now, the 12.9-inch iPad Pro sounds like a much bigger upgrade, especially if you're already coming from a 2018 or 2020 iPad Pro. That mini LED display could be really amazing. However, let's face it, the 12.9-inch iPad Pro isn't for everyone, and while the 11-inch display not having a mini LED display is disappointing, it's still $300 less than the 12.9-inch model, so I still think it's a compelling purchase. But if you already have a 2018 or 2020 11-inch iPad Pro, I don't think this is enough to warrant an upgrade yet. I still think you can wait another year for the next iPad Pro, and hopefully that 11-inch version that year comes with a mini LED display. However, even if you are getting the 11-inch iPad Pro, you are still getting an M1 chip. All of these iPad Pros now come with the amazing M1 chip. But there are some differences you need to be made aware of when choosing the storage tiers. Now, the 128GB, 256GB, and 512GB storage options of the iPad Pro all come with 8GB of memory, which is 2GB more than the previous A12Z iPad Pro. Now, what Apple doesn't really tell you on their website is that the 1TB and 2TB versions of the iPad Pro come with double the RAM, 16GB of memory. Now, if you're wondering why you need 16GB of memory on an iPad, don't look at me. Right now, I'm really not sure if there's any single application available on the iPad right now that could really take advantage of that much memory. I mean, it's just a substantial increase in the amount of RAM available on an iPad, like more than double of what the A12Z had. In fact, 8GB sounds like plenty to me based on what the iPad can currently do with iPadOS 14. However, I really think the story of this iPad update is kind of half complete. I don't see why Apple would specifically add the M1 chip and this much memory into an iPad configuration unless they were planning a big update with iPadOS 15. That would let us run Mac apps on the iPad. I mean, at this point, why shouldn't we be able to run apps like Final Cut Pro or Logic on our iPad when the iPad Pro and the Macs literally have the same exact chips inside of them? So I think Apple has something big planned for all this. So listen, I assume the future of the iPad Pro will eventually be able to take advantage of those larger memory configurations, but I gotta go off the info I have right now. And right now I just can't give you a definitive or solid answer on whether or not it's worth it to buy more memory. So I would only base your purchasing decision right now on if you actually need 1 or 2 terabytes of storage. I wouldn't base it on memory configurations right now if we don't have an idea of what iPadOS 15 looks like. That also brings us to the other elephant in the room. The fact that these iPads now have an M1 chip. That means we're going to have to talk about the other devices that have M1 chips inside of them, namely the MacBook Air and MacBook Pro. Because when you start adding some of these iPad Pro accessories, like the optional Magic Keyboard, which retails for $350 on the 12.9-inch iPad Pro, that's $1,449 together. $150 more than the M1 MacBook Pro. And by the way, that iPad Pro still has half the storage. Even without the keyboard, the 12.9-inch iPad Pro is $100 more than the M1 MacBook Air, again with half the storage. And I imagine even though the iPad Pro has 1 extra GPU core in the base model, the MacBook Air and iPad Pro are going to perform very similarly because the MacBook Air doesn't have a fan in it and the iPad Pro doesn't have a fan in it. Don't get me wrong, the MacBook Air and MacBook Pro can't do all the things an iPad can because the iPad has a touchscreen. So if you want to draw on the iPad with an Apple Pencil, Well, no MacBook can compete with that feature. If that feature's important to you, you gotta go for the iPad. And the iPad still has advantages in hardware, like a faster 120Hz ProMotion display, and the new mini LED display on the Pro models. It's going to be superior to any Mac display, and it can get up to 1000 nits of brightness, meaning that the iPad will probably look great even in direct sunlight, where maybe the MacBook Pro wouldn't. But I do think that this is a conversation we should be having. If you thought about going for an iPad Pro for a lower cost device that's portable and has good battery life and delivers in performance, well, now you have additional options you should consider with the M1 MacBook Air and MacBook Pro. And that might be a form factor that naturally works better for you. So when you're going to buy this iPad Pro, you have to consider those other options now. Now, if you want an iPad experience, but these iPad Pros are just way out of your budget, well, then you should still consider Apple's latest iPad Air, which shares a lot of the design traits of the iPad Pro, but comes with a weaker, but still relatively powerful A14 processor, has Touch ID on the power button instead of Face ID, and it loses the 120Hz ProMotion display. It retails for $599 for a 64GB model, and is compatible with all of the iPad Pro's accessories, like the Magic Keyboard and Apple Pencil 2. So it's almost the iPad Pro experience at $200 less than the iPad Pro. And if all of those sound out of your budget, well, don't worry, Apple does actually have an option for you there with the base model iPad, which does have an older design and is compatible with the older iPad Pro accessories like the first generation Apple Pencil, but it still actually has a pretty respectable A12 chip in it, and it's the best budget tablet available on the market right now, running at just $329 for a 32GB model. Basically, whether you're going for an iPad Pro or something else, you have a lot of options to consider to make sure you're getting the device that has the features you want and at a price point you can afford. All right, everyone, hopefully this video helped you out in deciding which iPad Pro you should buy and the important features you need to know about them, or maybe considering something else like a MacBook Air or an iPad Air. If it did, please give this video a like. If you want to see more from the channel, well, make sure you're subscribed. I'm going to be reviewing this iPad Pro, and I can give you even more information in that review. And if you are purchasing something today, consider using my affiliate link in the description below. That always helps the channel out. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next video. Take care, everyone.